questions, I do want to make sure I introduce our wonderful panelists. So my name is Jeff Torlina, and currently I am at Sienna College near Albany, New York, just 150 miles north of the city. And I've been studying working class culture for quite a long time. And this is one of our many panels on working class culture that were organized through our Class Culture Caucus. Thanks to all of you that showed up last night to our beverage and food and getting to know each other and discussing this concept of class culture and how we're going to try to build around it. And this is, to explain this session a little bit, I think it's valuable that in our conversation with our group, we were talking about things like one of the sessions that was proposed, I think, Bestie, you were in this morning's session was so wonderful, and we were asking, perhaps, how can we address this issue of addressing working class movements and the things that are in the way of creating broad-based grassroots movements for change that were going to make formal changes to our system. And we then decided, as one of my suggestions was, well, let's not forget as well that every day working class communities are creating alternatives to the system as it already exists, informally, just as a part of everyday life, because working class culture and cultures, because of course we can't define that in the monolithic form, has many alternatives to those who are providing the dominant narrative. Our theory, our conceptual framework about politics, about life, about inequality, and virtually everything are informed from oftentimes very different perspectives than what people experience in other social classes and in other settings. So the idea was to perhaps question, how is it that working class people, poverty class people, see the world in different ways and are creating ways of adapting, of resisting, of maintaining dignity, of supporting themselves, and finding ways through life that run contrary to the dominant formal expectations and the dominant systems. So we wanted to try to explore that. And in a panel such as this, each of our panelists are going to be discussing their own research and particular circumstances and cases and populations. So we have to remember that this is just a series of case studies that are going to be doing our best to represent a range of ideas and examples from which to build the conversation. So we don't want to try to express what we are collectively describing as the entirety of the issues. So, but nonetheless, given that, I've really invited each of these folks because they represent different dimensions of this idea of working class cultures that provide an alternative way to understand the world, to behave and to interpret the world such that people can get through their lives in respectable, dignified ways and hopefully even continue to survive and sustain themselves. So first we have Jennifer Sherman, who has come all the way from Washington State University, and we're so grateful that you're here. Thank you very much, and this is just, I'm so excited. I have never met Jennifer face to face, but from reading her work, I'm just thrilled that she is here. So just from Jennifer's bio on the professional page from the university's website, Jennifer's research focuses on the interactions of economic conditions, cultural norms, and family outcomes. So she studies rural poverty, unemployment, and low incomes to examine how meanings and morality shapes behavior and decisions that are impacted by economic constraints and community contexts. Would you say that's accurate enough for now?
That is darn close, yeah.
Which is ideal for what we're doing here. And I'm quite excited. And then Jackie Gabriel as well came all the way from the western slope of the Rockies at Western Colorado University, or Western State Colorado.
all right. They changed
deeply
the name.
apologized. So Jackie is just a wonderful, dynamic researcher that we've just, had the good fortune of getting to know 6 years ago now, right here and in this room, I think it was. So Jackie's now assistant professor of sociology, Western State Colorado University. Her interest in research has focused mainly on economic restructuring in the U.S. Her dissertation research, which she'll draw on today, explores the longest lockout in U.S. history between the United Food and Commercial Workers, UFCW, and a grain processing corporation in Iowa. So I can't give away any more than that because it's quite exciting. My name is Jeff Torlina, and I was not one of the panelists, but I will be filling in for an incredible friend and colleague of mine named Lynn England, who Lynn is an old sage, and I so much wanted to introduce him to our group, and likewise, he has so much to offer. He began his work really as in behavioral science, as a decision-making, he was doing game theory and other decision-making modeling, very mathematical, and over the years, just discovered the importance of community research and ethnography, and he became a really incredible ethnographer, and it would have been really exciting. And I have done work with Lynn, so I know enough of his work, and I have some of his earlier papers that I'll do my best to represent his work, but I won't be able to speak off the top of my head, so I'll do my best to read some points that I've put together in so hopefully a coherent form. But there was a mine disaster, a mine collapse that killed several miners back in 2007. And Lynn had just joined the faculty of the institution where I was working, and he just came to me and said, we've got to do something. These people need help. And I don't know what sociologists can do, but we drove on down to Huntington and began a several-year project to try to understand their circumstances and hopefully give voice to these people who were trying to challenge a number of institutional forces that I'll just explain a little bit later. But I do apologize that Lynn's not here, and I'll do my best to represent Lynn England. And I could talk a little bit about myself, but let's not do that. We'll wait for some other time. So why don't I pass the time over to Jennifer immediately. Thank you very much for being here.
Thanks so much for having me. Take a second here to get this set up. Is it okay if I'm here? Am I going to be too close? I can move that. Just need to locate this thing on the screen. Okay. So thanks again for inviting me, Jeff. I'm really excited to be here. The talk I'm giving today is called Trouble in Paradise, Labor Market Marginalization and Resisting Stigma in the Amenity-Rich Rural West. So my talk addresses some of the ways in which rural work ethics are performed in order to resist shame and stigma associated with economic need, but also the ways in which these performances are ignored and or misinterpreted by middle class and more privileged workers and employers within the same rural community. So I'm going to be drawing from some of my most recent field research, but also I'll be in dialogue with my sort of larger body of work, which has long focused on the interplay of cultural norms, work identities, and survival strategies. So in particular, I've looked a lot at the ways in which larger American understandings of work as moral and aid receipt as stigmatized, polluted, feminized, and immoral impact the choices that poor populations make in their lives in trying to survive job loss and poverty. And this is going to be an issue that my talk today will focus on as well. So I'm focusing on a rural Washington state community that I call Paradise Valley, and all the names here are pseudonyms. This is a formerly timber, mining, and ranching dependent community that spent a lot of the last 3 decades trying to reinvent itself as an outdoor recreation mecca that makes most of its money through tourism as well as second home ownership. It's also experienced recently a lot of in-migration by retirees, but as well by young families, young adults who are often leaving higher paid jobs in cities like Seattle and Portland. So they're bringing this past and current wealth with them over the mountains into this community. These are changes that have had a lot of positive impacts on this place, but they have also contributed to the growth of pretty serious inequality in this community, in this community that was once very homogenous, once very working class. And this has included some shifts in the labor market and in the division of community resources that I'll get into a little bit today. I don't want to spend a lot of time on literature, but I do want to introduce a few key ideas and concepts that are sort of necessary to situate this. First is just understanding amenity tourism as something that's been promoted to rural communities for several decades now as an effective form of rural development that's supposed to be able to reverse some of the downward economic trends and replace declining rural extractive industries, particularly in these kind of beautiful parts of the West. And it's had a lot of really positive outcomes for a lot of rural communities, things like job growth, population growth, higher incomes, and lower poverty rates. On the other hand, there are some doubts regarding the side effects of this form of development, and there's a lot of them, as you can see. There's concerns about the growth of low-wage and seasonal work, as well as rising housing costs. Researchers have also questioned the impact of tourism and in-migrations on different measures of community well-being, things like stability, density of relationships, collective action, and attachment of residents. There's been a lot of focus on what people call cultural clashing, which is sort of an umbrella term that's used to, look at issues it can be over the environment, over land use, politics, and values, but basically the differences between the older residents of a rural community and the newer ones. So Paradise Valley has really experienced both of these extremes, both the real positive and a lot of these negatives. It benefits a lot from this form of development, but it is also experiencing a lot of issues with things like gentrification, with low wage and seasonal work, and with this sort of social divide in which the middle class newcomers are benefiting while the working class old timers are being increasingly disenfranchised from their own home community. So I'll focus today on some of those outcomes, particularly in terms of the marginalization of these working class residents in the labor market. And I'll look a little bit at the roles of symbolic boundaries and symbolic capital in maintaining and reproducing inequality in this setting. So for Paradise Valley, the shifting social and economic terrain has resulted in a pretty rapid change in social structures there and the changing significance of different types of symbolic capital. So I will be talking about sort of the forms of symbolic capital, the kind of classical Bourdieu ideas that are really spoken about a lot in sociology. So things like human capital, social capital, cultural capital, all that. But I'll also be talking a bit about a fourth kind. This is a moral capital, which has been documented primarily by me, but by others as well, in rural American settings. And this is something that consists basically of external exhibitions of a person or family's morality according to locally constructed norms and understandings. So it can be such things as outwardly manifesting your work ethics or your family values, as well as things like avoiding behaviors that are considered stigmatized in your community. So often that means things like drug use, criminal activity, but also receipt of aid like welfare in particular. But it's often tradable for social capital, sort of, social ties, and the ability to mobilize them within your community. It can also be tradable for jobs and income, as well as education in different settings. Okay, so just to introduce the field site briefly, Paradise Valley is located on the eastern slopes of the Cascade Mountains. It has several thousand year-round residents, but about half the homes there now are owned by non-year-round residents, so it's a lot of second home ownership there at this point. And nearly half of all the local employment is in retail or the accommodations and food services sectors, so these are both really tourism-dependent industries. And the rise of this industry goes back several decades. The community pretty actively pursued this starting in the 1970s, but really ramping up over time as Washington State's logging industry began to collapse. So, the declines in the resource-based jobs like logging, but also ranching, mining, and some farming were countered in the late 20th and then really, rapidly increasing in the early 21st centuries by these rises in the tourism industry, which now pretty much dwarfs the land-based industries in the share of the local labor market. The research I conducted there consists of 10 months of field work. So I moved there and lived there from September 2014 to July 2015, Over that time, I conducted 84 open-ended, recorded in-depth interviews, and also 10 months of ethnographic fieldwork, which consisted of many things, but it also did include about 12 hours a week regularly doing volunteer jobs at a local food bank, a family support center, and a public library. I also volunteered regularly for all sorts of local events and organizations around the valley, and just really tried to immerse myself in life there and get to know people across the class spectrum and really be part of kind of everyday life and rhythms in the valley. My interview sample was 43% men and 57% women. An average age of 50 is just 22, so a lot of recent in-migration. Based on their self-reported income and the federal poverty guidelines, about 24% of the sample was classified as poor. Another 30% is low income, that's above the poverty line, but less than 200% of it. And then the rest, the other 46% of the sample was classified as middle class. That was really anyone who was 200% or more above the federal poverty line, and includes some very, very wealthy people, so that's a pretty wide window. And then lastly, before I get into the results, I do want to get into the terms I'll be using a little bit here. So throughout the analysis, I rely on two ideal typical terms, basically, newcomers and old-timers. And this is a distinction which I think on its face really greatly oversimplifies the meanings that are embedded in the terms. So this term newcomer is commonly used in Paradise Valley to refer to a group of people who are distinct, not only because of their time in the valley, generally less than 20 years, but also because of their wealth and their access to symbolic resources like human, social, and cultural capital, as well as they are generally politically pretty liberal. They are mostly Democrats. And then this sort of educated, wealthy, liberal in-migrants are contrasted against an opposing group, which is generally referred to through, again, both time in the valley, so usually more than 20 years, and then a number of images and terms that evoke a sort of working class and less educated background and a more conservative political ideology. And as you'll see, other terms are used on the ground to describe this divide as well, and they're somewhat problematic. So this is, redneck and trust fund art. So despite the fact that the terms I'm using are, I think, a little bit misleading because they seem to focus too much on temporality, you can see I've chosen them in part because they are actually native to the area. They're terms that are used on the ground that are somewhat less demeaning than some of the other options I had. So I'm trying not to disparage either group, but nonetheless, the distinction is much more about social class and about access to resources than it really is about time in the area. It just happens to map onto time pretty well. Participants in the research were classified as one or the other, and again, these are sort of extremes on what's much more of a continuum, but they're sort of oversimplified, classified using a 5-point measure that included time in the valley, income, education, political stance, and culture, sort of high or low. So time, again, is just one of these 5 pieces. So it is possible to have newcomers who were born there and old-timers who just moved there, but more or less the time piece is reasonably consistent, but I want you to understand this is a sort of imperfect label for something that's much more about social class. Okay, so getting into some of the findings. So in addition to all sorts of other challenges that are endemic to remote rural communities, Paradise Valley residents, pretty much old and new, were struggling to find year-round living wage jobs, particularly since the last sawmill closed in the late 1980s. So most of the remaining jobs now, including those in service and construction sectors, which are 2 of the biggest sectors left, these are low-wage, part-time, and usually seasonal as well. So for old-timers, the loss of those traditional unionized and living wage jobs was really noticeable and resulted for them in a pretty serious struggle to get by. This is a young man who grew up there saying, "It really sucks to grow up in an area and by the time you're old enough and raising your own family, you can't do the same work that your parents did and still get by, And I know a lot of people in that situation." Newcomers, on the other hand, who tended to have more education and more experience in professional and prestigious careers, were preferred for almost all jobs across the valley. So in addition to their higher education and their job skills, their abundant social and cultural capital also did help them to sort of easily outcompete the old-timers for the Valley's best jobs. In nonprofits, there's a lot of nonprofits there, also in research sectors, but also even the best paid and most reliable carpentry and construction jobs were going to these newcomer guys. So their ability to outcompete the old-timers for even blue-collar jobs led to a sort of reconception of what it means to be hardworking in this context, right? As it shifted away from a focus on kind of strength and labor and towards soft skills and reliability, right? The likelihood that you're going to show up on time every day, the ability to communicate with these upscale clients who you're building a house for started to matter more and more. So these old-timers, who generally had less human and cultural capital, repeatedly were lamenting the fact that the jobs were going to these outsiders. So here's Owen Roberts. He's a maintenance worker who'd spent his whole life in the Valley but really struggled to keep a living wage job. And he said this about finding work locally. He said, what there is here, it would be nice if people, if they would started something, if they would hire people from the Valley and not people from outside in here to work, because that does happen. It happens a lot, and it shouldn't. They should hire people from the Valley first and then look elsewhere, but I don't know why it doesn't seem to happen that way. And it did. The local employers talked about this too. They just wanted people from the outside. And these newcomers, on the other hand, did. So these were jobs that didn't fully utilize their skill set, but they did provide access to this type of rugged rural masculinity that many of these men found personally very rewarding, and it allowed them a flexibility that their professional jobs did not. But these were people who came in with lots of wealth, right? So if they had to take a 3-month sabbatical in the winter every year, they got to go skiing. They weren't trying, they weren't struggling to pay the rent. So for them, it was kind of great. So this is a carpenter, Sean Murphy, who had had a pretty high-powered professional career in a major city before relocating to Paradise Valley, and he chose this part-time work that didn't utilize his college degree but allowed him the freedom to pursue all sorts of outside interests. And he told me, I've always felt capable enough of doing whatever that I've never had to worry about getting a job. It's like, I'm happy to go do some physical labor thing. I can do construction. I have those tools. And there's construction here, no problem. I can do that. I didn't move here with any sort of plan on what I was going to do. So newcomers' ease at securing these jobs often made them quite skeptical of the old-timers who were struggling to find work. So both newcomer employers and employees frequently asserted that the local men just were bad workers who lacked the drive, motivation, and work ethic to find and keep local jobs. And so this is what Sean had to say about those old-timers who lack jobs. He said, people who say they can't find a job, that doesn't ring true to me. Finding a job that pays you enough to, say, buy land or a house, that's a different thing. So there's jobs available. Local restaurants constantly have a hard time filling positions. So I think there's a lot of people in the Valley who choose not to work those low-level jobs and instead choose to rely on assistance. I feel like if you have the initiative and then the human connections, the personal relationships that come with being here for a while, there's never a shortage of work to be done or found or created. But it does take initiative and somebody actually who's willing to bust ass and work hard. And so I feel like there are those opportunities, and sometimes there's a dearth of character as it relates to people willing to do those things, right? So even though he kind of nods to structure here, right, he does recognize that you can't buy a home on these wages. He still comes back around to really blaming these individuals for their lack of work and their lack of ability to get by on those jobs. And we see a similar sentiment here from Toby Cook. He's a 32-year-old middle-income cohabiting carpenter who similarly takes his labor market privilege for granted and judged those who lacked it as morally deficient. So Toby, who said he had no trouble finding work locally, believed that really anyone could find a job in Paradise Valley, and that those who could not had only themselves to blame. So he, like Sean, made no real connection between structural inequalities and labor market successes in Paradise Valley. And he told me, if you grew up here and you can't find work, there's a problem with the person, not the economy, right? Because people are always wanting work done around here. And I said, so who are the people that can't find work? And he said, I would say people that don't know a lot of people, or if you actually grew up here and you can't find work, then you're a drug addict, or you have a reputation of not being a good worker. So again, really blaming the individuals. So given their troubles in finding and keeping high-paying jobs, or even decent-paying jobs, and then their general lack of wealth to fall back on, many of the old-timers really did need to turn to others for aid. But in those endeavors, right, in those searches for help, they were faced with the challenges of rural cultural norms that prize self-sufficiency and stigmatize aid. So although many of them did seek different types of aid, there were really serious social and personal consequences for doing so. Receipt of formal aid, of course, fed into the newcomers' negative views of the old-timers, who, as you just saw, they're already portraying them as lazy and unwilling to work, and this is despite the fact that almost all aid seekers did live in households with at least one worker. So old-timers felt the need to devote a lot of their energy to assertions of their work ethics and their own values in order to resist and counter that shame or stigma that they felt or that they feared somebody else might be applying to them. And these were assertions that were both declarative and performative, depending on the settings. And so here's Owen Roberts again, right? This is our maintenance worker who struggled to survive. And he did seek numerous forms of aid, but he really made a point of distinguishing himself from those who he believed lacked his work ethics. And really, sort of like the newcomers, but for different reasons, was explicitly drawing boundaries between workers and non-workers and putting himself on the side of those workers. He said, people that are working are paying for people that don't want to work. And a lot of people around here are on food stamps that shouldn't be, because there is work out there if you want to work, but they don't because it's easier to be on food stamps. I said, do you think? And he said, oh, I know it. Like the food bank, they serve about 100 families a week. They shouldn't have to do that because there's people there that could work, but they don't want to because it's easier not to. I love to work. I've always loved to work. Like I said, I don't want to get aid if I don't have to, and I would rather work. Right, so we see the same rhetoric, but this time coming from somebody who's actually getting aid himself and struggling with it, but really trying to create that moral boundary between himself and those undeserving others. In addition to those types of declarations, often old-timers focused on actually demonstrating through actions and behaviors that they were these hard workers or strong families, again, in order to create that distinction between themselves and the sort of undeserving poor of stereotypes and stigma. And these performances took a few common forms, including specific behavioral scripts amongst those who actively sought aid. So my field notes from the food bank in particular noted multiple ways in which they took advantage of the sort of flexible environment created by this particular food bank in order to situate themselves as workers there and kind of blur the lines between worker and aid recipient. And so these passages just describe a couple of typical displays, which were often gendered, with men performing manual labor and women generally socializing or offering donations or something like that. But both types of performances allow them to blur that line between the workers and the clients. So first, there was a middle-aged man in a muscle t-shirt and jeans with a loud voice who, while he waited for his groceries, insisted on carrying out as many people's as possible. Anyone who might need to carry out, he grabbed their bags with or without their consent. He was very loud and showy about it, aggressively displaying his usefulness. And then secondly, there was a woman who came in today whom I'd not seen before, but whom others seemed to know. She showed a lack of deference to the staff, treating them as equals and friends rather than authority figures. She hung around for quite a while, talking to everyone, and like a number of people who come in this way, it wasn't clear to me whether she was worker, donor, or client. She turned out to be a client and got food like the others eventually. And then along with blurring the lines between worker and aid recipient, refusal of aid, as many forms as you could refuse, was another really common way in which to assert one's moral worth despite that economic need. So many people, again, who did accept some kind of aid also declared the importance of going without as much as possible. So Adeline Thompson said, I kind of grew up knowing that or feeling like you don't ask for outside help. Jessica Wheeler said, I like less government involvement. The more help you get from them, the more they poke into your life anyway. And finally, Jody Hammond here says, I probably could be eligible for food stamps, I'm sure. Oh, I am on state health care. I did get on state health care this year. And like I said, I probably could get on food stamps, but I don't eat that much. Okay, so I don't have a lot of time today, so I'll start wrapping up. Previous researchers, including myself, have explored the importance of moral concerns like these to populations living on the margins, and the importance of these different forms of morality as a symbolic boundary marker that allows those of a lower social status to lay some claim to success according to their own cultural norms and standards. For Paradise Valley's old-timers, all of these types of moral assertions allowed people who were marginalized in the labor market and the local community to make some claim to their own moral worth and their work ethics despite their positions of need. So these declarations and outward shows demonstrated to self, others, and friends, family, service providers, occasionally some random person like me, that the individual or family had a claim to their work ethic or their morality. What these claims to moral worth failed to do, however, was really address larger structural constraints, such as the labor or housing market and the lack of family support options in any constructive or tangible ways. Right? To the contrary, demonstrating your morality in these ways had very few tangible benefits in terms of improving anybody's social or economic status for Paradise Valley's old-timers, and instead resulted in the self-denial of necessary services with very little material payoff. Furthermore, these performances and these declarations mostly go completely unnoticed by the newcomers, who rarely interact closely with the old-timers and just assume from their disadvantaged and stigmatized circumstances that most of them are lazy, unmotivated, and struggling with drug and alcohol addictions. Thus, this moral capital that they're trying to create pretty much goes unrecognized and brings very few rewards. Right? Beyond the newcomers' dismissals of the old-timers is the reality that the newcomers are just not trading in this resource the way the old-timers had before they arrived, right? They seldom trade in morality. They systematically devalue this form of symbolic capital relative to the forms that they own and utilize in abundance, that social capital, cultural capital, education, human capital, all are worth a lot more in this community at this point. So moral capital really is of very little exchange value in modern-day Paradise Valley, where newcomers don't seem to rely upon or trade in it, and where old-timers are seen as lacking it regardless of their own claims to it anyway. So it fails to really act as a significant tradable capital, and instead kind of diminishes into one more boundary between old-timers and newcomers, which ironically serves mostly to further justify newcomers withholding resources and opportunities from the old-timers who they seem as lacking morality anyway. I know, it's a very sad story. So I'm going to wrap up. But basically, as I've shown, while working-class old-timers are resisting judgment here through both discursive and performative scripts, ultimately this resistance doesn't have a lot of impact on changing how they're viewed by middle-class outsiders who interpret their resistance through a lens of privilege. I call this lens of privilege class blindness in the larger body of work coming out of this field site, and it precludes those newcomers from fully understanding the challenges that the old-timers face, right? It allows them to interpret struggles to find work as evidence of a lack of work ethics versus the moral capital that the old-timers are struggling to create and assert. And I'm going to end there, but I look forward to the Q&A.
We didn't plan this. In fact, we just met. But what I'm going to offer in the next 15 or so minutes is somewhat of what might seem as contradictory to some of the stuff that Jennifer's presented, or at least problematizing notions of like moral capital, social capital, human capital, cultural capital, symbolic capital, whatever capital. I even have my own, I call it recovery capital, right? So this notion of capital I want to problematize. But before I go there, I just wanted to say that what I'm presenting today, and there's very little actually from my dissertation that I'm presenting today, but what I'm using as like the case study to understand these concepts like human capital and social capital comes from my work on my dissertation, which is finally completed and done and all that. But what I did is I looked at the longest lockout in U.S. history. A week prior to Labor Day in 2008, in my hometown, a local employer locked out 360 workers, and they today remain locked out. And my brothers, both of my siblings were among the locked out workers. And about 5 years into the lockout, it was pretty evident people weren't going back. And I wondered, what happens to these people, right? Because if you read most of the literature on deindustrialization, what you hear is a 55-year-old individual, or kind of the stereotype or archetype, is that a 55-year-old individual with 27 years in one plant with no formal education, what happens to him, and these were mostly men, over 97% men, what happens to him when he loses his job, when he's displaced, That's a question. What happens to this individual? What do you think? What does the literature tell us? Anybody?
Stays unemployed or has to take a much, much lower paying job, like fast food job or something.
I prefer one word. He's fucked.
Okay.
Right? Like, let's simplify it. Like, right? That this individual is screwed. That's a polite way of saying what I just said. I'm not always polite. So that he's screwed. And what I saw is these individuals weren't screwed. So how do we explain this? Is this some anomaly? Or is there something else missing? So I went back to my hometown and did fieldwork and tried to understand how these individuals and their families and the community remained economically viable in light of this long-term lockout. So when Jeff asked me to talk about my research today, I revisited the data I have. I interviewed 62 of the 360 locked-out workers, and I have nearly 300 hours of interview data. And my question wasn't about culture when I was asking them questions, but I liked what somebody said last night about they're allergic to the word culture. I lack the ability or willingness to, I think, see culture as separate from structure. And I think those are dialectical kinds of terms. And so looking back at my data that really looked at how these individuals remained economically viable and looking at structural, like restructuring, downsizing, outsourcing, what in their interview data spoke to culture or values or ideology. And so I started asking some questions. And so some of the questions I started asking myself is, how should working class people and those who occupy that position, how should they be understood and conceptualized, especially by us, myself included, as sociologists and academicians? How do they perceive their own lives, right, and their own experiences? How do they define this lockout? And what in that, their definition shows to me or highlights their culture, their ideology, their politics? How do they themselves define their position? Because we do a terrible job, I think, and speaking of myself included in that, I said we do a terrible job of defining them. So how do they define themselves and their class position? How do they define notions of dignity? And what do they believe? What do they value? And again, I didn't have the opportunity to go back and ask them that. I looked at what I already had and saw what kind of spoke to those questions. And again, as Jeff said, I don't want to speak for the working class. It's not monolithic. We know there's differences based on gender, ethnicity, race, sexuality, all those things. So I'm speaking from my own experience as a daughter of a manufacturing worker and as the only one in my family to not be in manufacturing work. And the experiences I have of growing up in that family, but also these hours of interview data with those displaced manufacturing workers. And what I come away with is that, again, this is just based on my case study. I don't purport to represent all working class or all experiences. But what I come away with is that we as academicians, and especially sociologists, we have a number of assumptions that are clearly problematic. And these assumptions shape our theories, they shape our research methods, they shape how we ideologically and theoretically think about working class people and their experience and their position in society. And so I want to problematize a few of the concepts. And this isn't really articulated well, I don't believe, because these are things I'm still working through. This notion of capital that you heard Jennifer speak about. I came away from my dissertation with a concept that I thought I developed called recovery capital, and where I looked at how do these people actually recover from their displacement, because that's how they talked about it. Like, I'm done with that, I'm over that, right? And then I found out that this actually exists in the addiction literature with recovering from addiction. And then I started thinking about the parallels between people that recover from alcoholism and other addictions and how these individuals might have been addicted to their positions in the plant, to their work, in maybe an unhealthy way that this lockout actually disrupted and actually provided opportunities. You don't think of deindustrialization necessarily as providing opportunities, but what I found is there was room for opportunity. So back to the assumptions that we as sociologists tend to make. Concepts like social capital, human capital, and cultural capital. I don't know if those are terms that we're all in this room familiar with, but social capital is basically our social networks, right? How can we connect with one another to find jobs? How can we connect with one another to find resources? And then human capital is conceptualized mostly in the sociological literature, is formal education and formal training. And then cultural capital, we all know working class, we have no culture, right? That the things like, going to a softball game and talking about, your daughter's batting average, that somehow that's not cultural capital. But it is when you're looking for a job in a small town, right? So what I see in the literature, and again, I'm new to a lot of looking at the cultural aspect of this and moving away from structure, is that we have conceptualized and measured social capital, human capital, and cultural capital in a way in which we dehumanize, or not dehumanize necessarily, but we devalue and delegitimize working class people as having none of those three things, or very little of those three things. And what I found in my research is these workers that were locked out have tremendous social networks. I found something similar when I looked at immigrant communities over a decade ago and their efforts to unionize. That if you go to, I have a little bit of experience as a union organizer, you go to a white household in the suburbs, you may sign up one person for interest in coming to a meeting, what we call house calling, right? You go out, do a house call, and you walk away with maybe one person somewhat interested in joining a union. You go to a Latino community to a mass, or you go to an apartment complex, you have one interview, you leave there with about 17 names. You go to one soccer game, you leave there with 35 names. So this notion that working class people lack social capital is really problematic. We have strong social networks, and we can draw on those social networks. And in fact, the locked out workers they very easily drew on those social networks to find informal employment the early days in the lockout, and as the lockout progressed and went into its second, third, and fourth year, they gained more stable employment, more formal employment through those same networks. This isn't novel. Granovetter said that we get the weak ties, right? We get our access to jobs through our connections. Well, working class people have those strong social networks. This notion that somehow working class individuals don't have human capital, I think this is beat into their heads by their employer purposely, and also academicians don't do much justice either, at least in my experience in sociology. These workers had tremendous human capital, that you learn a lot on the job, right? That formal education isn't the only type of education. There's experiential education. You gain skills on the job. My brothers, again, manufacturing, and these workers I talk to, way more skilled than I am. I mean, if I get a flat tire, I call AAA, right? So this notion that skills skills and knowledge only come through formal education is clearly problematic to me. These workers, especially the maintenance workers, they would talk about their time in the plant. Most of the workers, the mean tenure at the plant was 27 years for the workers I interviewed. This plant was built in 1943, and it's handed down 3 generations to a local employer. And the plant was like jerry-rigged. It was just taped together to listen to some of their stories. And they had to be really innovative. And they learned a lot by piecing together the plant and solving problems that would occur in the plant, especially the maintenance workers. So this idea that the work that they do, any monkey could do that job or whatnot, is really problematic. And then again, as I said about what's also linked is that notion of cultural capital. I believe that we have a lot of culture and a lot of cultural capital. So that's the capital piece. The other thing is social mobility. We tend to put so much emphasis on social mobility. And what I found in looking at this interview data is there's this assumption that we all aspire to move up. And these people, not all of them do. People are quite content, for better or for worse. I'm not the judge of that. But in their own words, they demonstrate that they are comfortable and quite content in their position. So this assumption that we have that everybody aspires to move upwardly, or to be upwardly mobile, I think is somewhat problematic. And then kind of lastly, I don't want to go on too long, but this idea of agency, and that, again, we as a working class or working class people don't have agency, that we're passive victims of restructuring and capitalists and capitalism and all those buzzwords. What I found is, again, through that human capital that these workers possess, that social capital, cultural capital, they exercise agency. as most working class people you talk to will tell you, they can't sit around and wait for an opportunity to come to them. They exercise tremendous agency. They're not passive victims. The majority of the 64 workers, the overwhelming majority, I believe it's 97% of the workers I talked to 5 years out said they were better off. Better off. Again, I hate to draw from my family experience, but one of my workers, after 22 years in the factory, was making about $65,000 a year, again with 22 years experience, and moving up the internal ladder that did exist there. He was displaced, and he's making over $100,000 now. Right? And this is just one example. I could go on and name a number of others. So most of the workers indicated, the overwhelming majority of workers indicated they were better off. A caveat to that is not all of them said economically better off. Right? The majority said economically better off. But those that were entering their 60s and were addicted to a paycheck or that good overtime, they would say things like, thank God he locked me out. I spend so much time with my grandchildren. Right? That somehow the employer did them a favor because they were workaholics and addicted to that job, and now they have some kind of release that they have time to spend with their family, their friends, at church, and whatnot. So again, to kind of reiterate, this notion of capital needs to be problematized when we speak about different classes and also social mobility and agency. And then one thing that also stood out is in this lockout, the dignity that these individuals expressed in the interview data was pretty tremendous. That on the lockout, they were very clear on who they thought was in the right and who was in the wrong. Kind of maybe like this moral capital. That the lockout was inspired and motivated by maximizing profits and greed. It didn't have to happen. This company was doing well, and it's continuously doing well. But it was inspired by maximizing profit, and that they were dignified individuals that put people, their fellow workers, and whatnot as more important than a paycheck or than profit. So dignity was something that keeps coming back, and they're not apologetic for choosing what little maybe choice they did or did not have coming out of high school going into the factory. They're not apologetic for the years that they spent in the plant. They're not apologetic for not getting an education. In fact, to some extent, they delegitimize. They delegitimized me and my education. They would ask me questions about how much do you make? How secure is your job? Right? And I was quite honest. Like at that point, I was precarious. I mean, that might even still be now. I don't have tenure. Right? So they weren't apologetic how we as sociologists tend to suggest that they need to be, or that there's something wrong with their class position. Anyway, I'm belaboring that issue, I think. Then lastly, and I'm probably skipping something, but maybe it will come up in the Q&A. What I hear a lot about recently, and feel like I apologize or tend to be apologetic, and I want to move away from that, is that, working class white men in particular, and that's the case study, it was overwhelmingly white, that these guys buy into Republican rhetoric, that they blame women and their fellow workers and immigrants and blacks, and that they're highly religious and have such false consciousness and whatnot. And hardly anywhere in my data is reference to God or religion, which surprised me. And I didn't even think about that when I was analyzing the data the first time. There'd be reference like, thank God I got a job. But they didn't mean like literally thank, Jesus Christ or whoever God is, whoever she is. They were clear on the reason that they were locked out was to maximize profits. They understood, and they didn't blame the so-called scabs that crossed the picket line to go in and take their jobs. They didn't blame the progression of women. They didn't blame migrants to this country or immigrants to this country. So that kind of archetype that's coming out of like currently in some of the literature, I think that we also need to be careful about, because these individuals have dignity, they have self-respect, they deserve our respect, they possess capital, they possess agency, and they're not all backwards, if you want to use that pejorative term. That's all.
Well, without adding commentary besides how much fun I'm having, let me do my best to channel Lynn England. So try to envision a soft-spoken, short of stature, white-haired, wise old man. And I'll do my best up to the wise part.
I don't know if this is serendipitous, but I just got an email from Lynn England.
No way!
No, it just came up down here.
Awesome!
It's
So
okay.
he is alive. That's good. Lynn does so many things that sometimes he gets completely distracted. So this is the data that we used. I worked with Lynn on this project. He's just so much better and so much more knowledgeable of the wide range of issues that I really wanted him to be introduced to y'all. But this is, like I said earlier, related to a disaster, a coal mine collapse. So all of our data that we report here, we did quite a bit of participant observation as well as many in-depth interviews with community leaders, union leaders, etc. But the things that are reported here came from a website that was produced by the community itself, by the miners and the surrounding community, in order to try to explain their perspective. So I'll get into it further, but I'll begin with a description of the disaster that was posted on their website called Crandall Canyon Voices. Crandall Canyon was the name of the mine. So on Monday, August 6th, 2007, at 2:48 a.m., the Crandall Canyon coal mine in Emery County, Utah, experienced a rare and extremely violent seismic event, which registered a magnitude of 3.9 to 4.0 and tremored for nearly 4 minutes. Within hours, rescue teams began tunneling through coal and rubble in an attempt to reach 6 men believed to be working approximately 3.4 miles from the mine entrance under highly volatile conditions, one veteran miner described as worse than any had ever seen. Tragically, on August 16th, at about 6:30 p.m., another seismic event caused the walls of the tunnels in which a rescue team was working to Another seismic event caused the walls of the tunnel in which a rescue team was working to explode, killing 2 miners and 1 MSHA inspector, and injuring at least 6 other men. At this point, the underground rescue efforts were halted and deemed too unsafe to resume. So there was the original mine collapse on the 7th of August that killed or trapped 6 men who are still there, and then there was a later event 11 days later that killed the rescuers that were trying to reach them. So the miners in the community struggled to control the narrative of the disaster in the face of alternative definitions from powerful institutional actors, such as the mining company and its owner, Robert Murray. The U.S. Mine Safety and Health Administration, or I'll use MSHA from now on, made an official report. Committees of the U.S. Senate and U.S. House of Representatives both held hearings and drew conclusions about the event. Utah state government and the governor made its own report, and each of the stories about the mine collapse ignored the standpoint of the miners. So the community created a website called CrandallCanyonVoices.com to be a vehicle to help tell their perspective. The people's standpoint produced 2 conflicting positions. The first is the strong desire for the outside world to understand their situation. The second is the belief that only the miner can truly understand it. The community's website presents the need for the local perspective, but bemoans the difficulty of conveying that knowledge to others who lack the basic experience and perspective with which to relate. So from the website, they say, and I do apologize, our other 2 presenters were so great at presenting, and here I am reading, so I really do apologize, but nonetheless. Perseverance has been further impeded by often sensational, biased, and inaccurate news reporting, and the naive and disrespectful assessments of opinion peddlers from outside our region who understand little about coal mining and coal mining culture. Residents are currently watching certain political leaders haggle over the Crandall tragedies and the future of the coal industry without the proper knowledge needed to guide their assessments in a fair and constructive manner. Knowledge which comes from living in a coal mining community and working inside a mine. Moreover, many residents are listening to the congressional hearings and the political rhetoric surrounding the Crandall tragedies with an understanding that many of these politicians were engaged in advocating an anti-coal agenda prior to August of 2007.
So this statement is followed by further elaboration of the difficulty of asserting the miner's perspective in the face of opposing standpoints held by the powerful outside forces. Excuse me. So this is from Crandall Canyon Voices. All of the data will come from that, but this is one of those block quotes. Increasingly, a number of people from emanating carbon counties are becoming convinced that the future of our region hinges on the voices of local residents being heard, validated, and acted upon. It is the opinion of the moderators that within ongoing political maneuvering and sensational journalism, the voices, expertise, and real needs of Utah's coal mining communities, and particularly its highly skilled and intelligent miners, have been overlooked, misrepresented, and even ignored. So mining is a difficult, dirty, and dangerous occupation, to put it simply and mildly. Huntington is in an isolated rural area that is mostly desert. The mine itself is in rugged mountains. The area is far from the comforts of metropolitan locations with amenities and conveniences that most of us would consider to be essential to basic necessities. So why do the miners in their community struggle to defend their industry and their potentially lethal jobs and their community in such an inhospitable environment? So that's one of the things that I'm hoping I can elicit, but that is complicated. The governor of Utah, MSHA officials, congressional committees, and company leaders all made pronouncements about the event following the initial cave-in through daily press conferences. Each offered official accounts that were widely disseminated. The president of the mining company took control of the press conferences and spoke first to assert what had happened and to give a knowledgeable, authoritative assessment, in his words. He presented himself as speaking for the miners, his company, and MSHA by proclaiming a definitive account for the events in which he was the heroic rescuer. Experts were consulted and interviewed by the media to help the public understand. And a spectacle was created with the media city constructed at the entrance of the Crandall Canyon mine and in Huntington itself. And at the same time, community members talked about them among themselves. Miners re-entered the mine to join the rescue effort. Signs were hung in Huntington and the neighboring communities expressing solidarity with and sympathy for the trapped miners and their families. And prayer and memorial services were held locally. For the community, the fallen ones were their miners. The miners posted their accounts of events on CrandallCanyonVoices.com, in part because of their belief that misinformation was being presented by the media. MSHA officials and the governor and the company owner all were outsiders. The following postings to the comment board at CrandallCanyonVoices.com attest to the dissatisfaction many local citizens felt. The coverage of the disaster was alien to their own understanding. For example, I was thoroughly disgusted by how the media represented our community during this event. I was also disgusted in how they treated our community members. They tried to act so concerned on the news while they constantly misquote us, insult our community, harass grieving family members, and say things to make the outside world think mining is unreasonably safe. They give ammo to the politicians who want to shut us all down. This posting notes the community members' perception that the outsiders disrespect for the local residents, especially the coal miners. A second example asserts the superiority of local knowledge of the coal miners in disaster. So this says, the true experts are the miners. Unfortunately, most of the world does not seem to get this. If a person really wants to know about what's going on inside those mountains, they should ask a coal miner, not a politician or a guy in a nicely pressed suit who has never seen the inside of a mine. So these comments and many others claim that the media, national and state politicians, and well-educated experts simply do not understand coal mining, its significance, its lifestyle, the disaster, or the way all of these intertwine. Postings by Huntington residents repeatedly stated in the belief that quote-unquote expert knowledge is inadequate, naive, and biased. The formal authorities are the object of local tales and jokes, which emphasize the lack of practical experiential knowledge. The website postings characterize the outsiders' versions of the disaster as arrogant and prejudiced. Outsider concern for the miners is perceived by community residents as feigned and superficial. The postings assert the local standpoint and justify the superiority of their perspective. The voices from this mining community are unanimous in their anger and belief that outsiders do not understand Huntington or the Crandall Canyon situation. This is a quote. I don't think people can possibly understand unless they've been underground. Indeed, the miners seek to tell their story of the disaster as a way to explain why they find dangerous, dirty, difficult work virtuous, and why they choose to live in an isolated rural community, and why they identify their interests with those of coal mine owners and corporations that seem to have little regard for their well-being. The disaster is constructed in ways that exhibit the miners' courage, dignity, and importance. Through CrandallCanyonVoices.com, they affirm their logic to each other and to the outsiders. The postings of the miners, neighbors, and the families of those killed offer insights that diverge dramatically from the views of outside officials, company spokespeople, and media figures. So I'll just speak briefly about the miners' work and their identity as expressed through the website postings. Pardon me as I labor through this cursor. The identity of the coal miners and the character of their communities result from two major factors, according to our analysis. First, the nature of underground mining shapes the workers' identities and their sense of the profession and their relationships. Second, a culture, if you will, a reality and a morality, has developed out of the miners' work that sets them apart from most other blue-collar workers and from white-collar work. It is foreign to the upper class and to the white-collar middle classes. So basically about underground mining. Underground mining creates a unique character in those who labor below the surface of the land. The physical and psychological challenges of removing material from deep in the earth, where injury and death may strike randomly, shape each individual into what is collectively recognized as a miner. The dangers are illustrated locally within the Carbon-Emery County coal mining area, where mining disasters took 246 lives in the Schofield disaster of 1900, 172 lives in the Castlegate disaster of 1924, and 27 lives in the Wilburg mine fire of 1984. And many other smaller events have taken additional lives and severely injured miners, making injury and death part of the way of life. For the community and the miners, each death and injury has a face, a family, and a personal tragedy that is woven into the miner's identity and the nature of their community. In addition to the danger, miners develop a unique perspective because they experience nature, especially the mountain in which the mine is located, in a dynamic and intimate form. In the mine, the mountain most people experience is solid and unchanging, becomes a malleable, often violent entity with its bumps, shifting, and flowing water. Miners experience the violence when the mine walls bump, sometimes exploding inward. They know the mountain inside and out. It is not only their place of work inside, but their place of play outside, where they hunt deer and elk, hike, camp, and picnic with their coworkers and family. Their relationship to the mountain approaches that of a religious or mystical sense. So I'd like to talk about their identity and community as well that comes out of this location. The identity developed in the context of underground mining and the potential for disaster carries with it several prescriptions for behavior on the individual level, in their worldview, and in collective memory. It produces a collective identity that extends beyond the miners themselves to the entire community. Miners frequently express the sentiment that local conditions and danger produce a collective, egalitarian identity. Every worker depends on all those in his or her crew. If one makes a mistake, all may suffer or die. If anyone gets in trouble, as happened on August 6, 2007, all react without regard for personal well-being, and as if it were they themselves in need. One cannot, they explain, worry about a fellow miner's race, background, or moral condition while underground, because every person relies on every other person on the crew. Families of miners cling to the recognition that when their loved ones are underground, the other miners will be there to help in case of any difficulty. This posting presents the sense of obligation felt by miners to protect their workmates. This is a relatively long block quote, so excuse me. But other miners, such as my buddy Dale, went in there as part of the mine rescue effort to try to locate the missing six. Dale did this on his day off. Nobody made us do it. We did it because all of us knew, at least one of the guys in there, I think. And we all did it because we knew that if it could have been any one of us trapped. We knew that if we were in there and alive, that we'd be waiting for our friends and coworkers to get us out. There were guys in there digging with their hands and trying to get to the six immediately after it happened. No one told them to do it. They just did it. We went because of our loyalty to the six, and their families made us do it. Of course, I don't think the outside world will ever understand that. So the miners' rescue efforts put themselves at risk, as shown by the eventual death of the 3 rescuers. But this is not extraordinary for the miners. It is expected behavior within the community. The sense of solidarity in the community is reflected in the miners' language. The terms in by and out by reflect the directions relative to the mine tunnel mouth. The miners in the community are in by. The outsiders are always out by. An appeal of mining is the network of personal connections elicited from the mining experience. The close personal ties are essential for the safe extraction of coal, which is the lifeblood of the local community. These experiences create family-like connections between the members of their communities. They are in by. Miners often speak of these intimate personal bonds. One miner described the 93 coal miners who worked with him in the mine as a large family. The dangers of mining produce the sense of mutual reliance on and common support. This should not be romanticized, however, as illustrated by the continued psychological trauma, survivor guilt resulting from the event, and the suicide of one of the rescue survivors. So the total was added by one more to 10. It is the potential for tragedy and the unfortunate frequency of disasters, combined with the nature of the work in an enclosed area, that creates this interconnected community. And I've cited a few other scholars if anyone's interested. As a miner, going by the handle Uncle Jay posted, the miners at Crandall Canyon, as in much of the underground coal mining industry, are a very tight-knit group of men. They learn to rely on each other day in and day out. They associate with each other on and off the job without regard as to whether they are a foreman or equipment operator. The two Crandall Canyon miners who lost their lives in the rescue effort were both foremen who were doing all they could to reach their fellow miners. The close-knit, family-like relationship and the community developed a set of beliefs and approaches to life that characterize coal miners. A posting describes this culture. Understand, coal miners do have a culture of their own. Whether they are from the eastern or western coal mines, it seems to be the same. The vast majority of the population would not be able to relate to or understand this culture. Working in underground mines, they are exposed to an environment that challenges that few people ever see. The environment in which they work has developed a culture that makes them a little different than the rest of society, and they are proud of it. They take this culture into their families and communities. As we have seen, the news media and the politicians don't seem to be able to relate to or understand us. Of course, I don't believe they have even bothered to try. So if I may just remind us, that was one of the miners writing this. It was not the scholars writing about this experience. The interpersonal connections and the strong emotional ties to community contribute a positive collection of sentiments concerning mining. Wives, children, friends, the entire community share in the sense of danger and the sentiments. The difficulty of the work provides tangible evidence of strength and willingness to sacrifice for the benefit of others, even tapping into patriotic notions of defending the interests of the nation as a whole. The positive dimensions and the meaning of work for underground coal miners provide a logical justification for the defense of their jobs and ways of life. Listening closely to the miners promotes understandings of why they can be positively oriented to such seemingly negative work. Frequent statements on the community's website insist that miners do this work, quote, because we want to. For example, in a sermon delivered at the funeral of one of the miners, the speaker noted, Dale's career was coal mining. He chose to work in the coal mine. He chose to work in the mining industry. Another miner's posting concurs. He said, this was Martinez, he identified himself as, I love my job. I don't have to do it. There are a lot of jobs I could take, but I love mining. It has its risks, but there are jobs that are more dangerous. I'm a coal miner. I'm good at what I do. Unlike many of those people who sit in their cubicles all day, I really like going to work most days. The love of the work, the camaraderie with the miners, and the devotion to the underground mine are common in spite of the fact that the risk of injury or death for miners is among the highest in the United States occupations. It is work in the expansiveness of the complex of mine rooms and tunnels. The work is heavy and, like all physical labor, the activity can take a physical toll over time. The work is dirty, the coal dust is harmful to lungs. Outsiders may try to explain the decision to become a miner based upon the limited occupational choices for rural residents who live in surrounding areas. Nonetheless, the citizens make a compelling case that the positive associations with mining make it the occupation and lifestyle of choice. The hazards of mining are acknowledged by everyone, but the risks are recognized as necessary sacrifices for living a life that they desire. One miner says, I worked for the railroad when I was young, but the day I quit and went to work in a coal mine, I thought I had died and gone to heaven. So just briefly, I'll have to try to describe the culture and morality of mining, just like I say, briefly, just to give a flavor. The connection to the locale, the danger, the egalitarian nature of underground mining, and the preference for mining as an occupation produce a unique morality and reality. First, the moral code is connected to the performance of physically challenging work that carries with it the indicators of strength, virtue, dignity, toughness that are regarded favorably in working class circles. And I cited myself on that. One of the local citizens expressed some of the moral qualities associated with miners, especially those who were struggling to find the 6 men. Thank God there are people who really know what honor, value, commitment, integrity really are. To the miners that are trapped and the ones risking their lives to reach them, you are heroes. That was Kevin who posted that. The miners revealed their enormous sense of commitment to the code of honor they associated with work when explaining the duty to risk their lives to find their fellow miners after the mine collapse, a duty that calls for action, not speculation. Furthermore, coal mining is an occupation that makes demands on workers that set them apart from others, creating solidarity and cohesion. From hearing testimony posted on the CrandallCanyonVoices.com website, miner Warren Okias said miners take pride in their work and environment. Coal mining isn't suitable for some people, he said. The miners place importance upon their identities as hard workers. One of the men lost in the disaster was remembered admirable by his daughter as a hard worker, and she said, he was not afraid of work. It couldn't be half-assed. He worked hard to support his family. Another contribution on the KSL comment board, which was also posted on the website titled, "These Are Some Tough Men," shared this description of the miners participating in the rescue effort. No heroes anymore? All I have to do is look west and I can see a mountain full of them. From the miners, down to the drillers, to the command center, on down to the community. I know the families of the trapped men and the rescuers are showing strength we can only admire and hope to emulate. The hard work shapes the identity and culture of the miners, but being a miner depends upon more than simply working hard. It becomes part of their identities in ways that reinforce the values of duty, honor, and commitment. One's identity as a miner carries with it prescriptions for action that demand sacrifice and devotion to ethical standards beyond the self-interest of the individual miners. A posting by Jared Y. speaks of the reaction of some miners immediately found the cave-in. Tim Curtis. This guy has the courage of 10 men. Him and another guy turned around and went right back into the mine to get them guys out. The coal and the rocks were still falling as they crawled over the debris and tried to reach them. He's a hero for having the guts to sacrifice himself and try to save them. When 6 workers did not come out of the mine after its collapse, their fellow miners vowed to find them, dead or alive, despite the possibility that it might cost them their lives as well because of the unsafe conditions. It was considered their duty. This miner adds to an earlier comment to explain why he and his fellow miners risked another collapse of the mine to dig for their buried workmates. 2 of our own died in the process. Like all of us, they were scared, and they knew damn well they were going into the valley of the beast, so to speak, but they were willing to put their lives on the line to try to save the life of another as long as there were even the slightest chance of survival. This is why Dale, Brandon, and Gary died heroes. The daughter of the MSHA official who died in the rescue effort that also killed the 2 miners, Dale and Brandon were the miners, and Gary was the MSHA official. She provided this account. I kept asking him if he had to go. I would ask him every day if he was going, and he replied the same way he had when, as a child, she asked the same question. He just said, "This is my job. I have to go and do my job. I have to go." The culture of mining becomes part of each miner in intangible ways, creating a sense of self that is deeply entwined with a particular expression of dignity, disposition, and conduct. The impact of mining in developing character traits is not limited to the miners themselves. Consider this description of the community by a miner at the funeral of one of the men killed in the rescue attempt. That's how this area is. It's nice to have an opportunity to come together and enjoy that community in the tie. Community is what the miners and the Huntington residents cling to most fiercely. The closeness of the community depends upon the dangers of the mining coal and the associated connections between the miners, something to value and defend at any cost. Another dimension of the honor of coal mining is seen in the assertion of the contribution that the coal industry makes to the nation's energy supply, to its general social and economic well-being. The miners believe they create a product that is essential for modern society. They see their effort as indispensable to the nation's economy and standard of living. A posting from the comment board on the website reminds readers of the mining's importance to society. Bad things happen to good people, this posting says. The mine collapse was an accidental occurrence. Mining is a convenience for you and I, and a life-threatening occupation for those who do it. We all take our modern conveniences for granted, just assuming we will always be able to flip the light switch, have cold food in the refrigerator, use the oven and microwave. Do you realize if all the miners decided the risk was too great and the money just isn't worth it, it would be a matter of hours before we were living like our ancestors? I am so thankful for the miners and the risks they take every day. I pray every day for their safety and the rescue for the families, hope, peace, and support. Today we should all thank a coal miner anywhere. And I'm almost done. The strong community connections create a powerful sense of place that makes it difficult to imagine living elsewhere for those in the community. Moreover, this industry and the community which depends upon it, like many extractive industries, have their economies well-being tied to the location in which the resources are deposited. When the coal is gone or when the extraction is too challenging to be conducted profitably and within OSHA guidelines, the mines close and the miners and their families must seek employment in another mine. Mining communities are therefore intimately connected to the locality and the specifics of their mines, another dimension of mining culture. Mines are among the relatively few remaining American workers who still have a direct and sustainable relationship with the earth. One miner comments, they work inside the place. They play on the same hills. They recreate as hunters, fishermen, explorers, and campers in what they consider to be their mountain terrain. They literally come to know the mountain inside and out. These features of mining are important motivations for miners to defend their livelihoods. The lifelong miner and mine supervisor Peter Siderloff wrote a book on the subject, and he describes it this way. No objectively written article can ever tell the story of a coal mine. To me, every coal mine has not only a story, but also a distinct personality. It is discovered, it is born, it lives, and dies. Beyond that, there is a romance and a fascination about coal mining that is hard to explain. Perhaps that is a combination of things: challenge, danger, gamble, capriciousness, mystery. Perhaps it is in dealing with great and even awesome forces. Perhaps it is an awareness that you are putting your hand into something that nature was 150 million years or so in making. If someone has never seen and felt all of this in a coal mine, you could. It's there. So for the miners, this becomes part of one's soul. For the community, it is its essence. The close and personal connection to the natural setting of the mine translated to a desire to defend mining lifestyle to a degree that urban and suburban citizens have difficulty understanding. Explaining the miner's relationship to the mining industry and the mining company and to the federal agencies becomes problematic then for us observers from outside, because we don't understand, number one, why would anyone want to do this job? Why would anyone want to live in this remote, desert, isolated community? Why would people go through all this struggle and risk their lives for seemingly very little? So there's just a couple points I wanted to make. Miners want safe workplaces, but they know that danger is part of the job and can never be eliminated entirely. The risk of death and injury is such a part of the identity and community solidarity that it is regarded as something to reduce as much as possible, but not so much to make mining impossible. The miners are deeply connected to the place, and they strive to protect the viability of their jobs and their communities. Sometimes that translates into resistance to further regulations and into support for the corporation's interests. Number three, the mining community used the website Crandall Canyon Voices to present their own narrative and to challenge the narrative of powerful other institutional forces. And then lastly, they disregard the definitions of their situations by experts and institutional actors as misinformed and ignorant. So I'll end with that. Now hopefully we can have a conversation in the time. Well, I do have to take the blame for getting over here late and all. But what is our next thing on the event? We have our dinner tonight?
Yeah. If you want to stay, if you're willing to stay.
Hell yeah.
Right.
Perhaps we can take it up afterwards.